Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
During the early morning hours of the 25th of April, 1980, in the desert in central Iran, an explosion rocks the night. That explosion is the result of a collision that has occurred between two U.S. military aircraft, one a CH-35 Sea Stallion helicopter, the other a C-130 transport plane, that has taken place during refueling operations at the staging area that's known as Desert 1. Desert 1 is the staging area for the operation known as Eagle Claw. Eagle Claw being the plan that has been put into place under the orders of American President Jimmy Carter in an attempt to rescue the hostages that have been held in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran since November of 1979. The explosion at Desert 1 follows a series of events that have led up to that point for what appears to be a very ill-fated operation. And so the decision is made to abort the rescue operation at that point, with the loss of the helicopters, the loss of American servicemen life, and the inability to move forward with the operation. Welcome to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast, and today we're going to explore what would have happened, potentially, under the scenario where there wasn't the quote-unquote debacle at Desert 1. The early part of the operation, again known as Eagle Claw, and what resulted in it being aborted or failing in its effort to rescue the American hostages that were being held as part of the hostage crisis of 1979 and 1980. However, before we proceed down the fork in time, we're going to take a quick break here to hear from one of our affiliates, and then we'll be back to explore the alternative history of what could have happened with a successful or a different Operation Eagle Claw.
Would groceries delivered to you in as fast as 1 hour save you a trip to the store? Instacart makes that possible thanks to personal shoppers in your area who hand-select items based on your preferences from the stores you love. And shopping multiple stores is possible on a single order. Instacart picks the freshest produce and even keeps your eggs safe, all while finding everything you usually buy, providing smart suggestions for new items, and even highlighting deals to help you save money. And now you get free delivery on your first order over $35. Let Instacart know we sent you and help support our show by following the link in the show notes. Instacart, groceries delivered in as fast as 1 hour.
Welcome back. Again, I'm Don Shelley, your host, and we appreciate you joining us here today on A Fork in Time as we look at an alternative timeline or alternative history that could have resulted from a different result from Operation Eagle Claw, the failed United States rescue attempt in April of 1980 to free the American hostages that were being held in Tehran. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with the background here today. It's a well-known story, I believe, and most people should be familiar with the story of the Iranian hostage crisis. And so we'll certainly include links in the show notes, as we often do, to various articles on the internet that will provide background. It's important to note that the hostages had been, at that point, held for about 5 months. And the planning for a potential rescue attempt had actually begun shortly after the seizure of the American embassy, which happened in early November 4th of 1979. And so while the plan was not ordered and executed to go forward, it had been the planning stages for multiple months, with U.S. Special Forces, including the newly formed Delta Force, or recently formed Delta Force, taking the key lead on the particular planning for the operation. The operation was going to be complicated because the embassy was located inside of downtown Tehran, and so have the difficulty of not only achieving the safe liberation of 53 of the hostages that were held there, but also working on how to get to them as well as extract them safely if they could be reached and successfully rescued. And so I'll also include in the show notes a link to more information about the operation itself and the planning associated with that. That's an entirely different, interesting exercise that someone who may not be familiar with would want to look at in terms of the complexity of the plan. We'll talk a little bit about that as we look at an alternate timeline, one of two that I'd like to explore today, but not going to spend a lot of time going into the background on that, except to say that there were certainly challenges to mounting a rescue attempt at an embassy that was being held inside of a large city. So as we begin our exploration of the fork in time, the alternate, let's look at the first of those, which is what would have happened with a successful Operation Eagle Claw. I'm going to define a successful Operation Eagle Claw as that all of the elements of that complex plan actually came together, and the result of that was that all 53 of the American hostages and all of the troops and special operations forces and other elements that were involved in the rescue plan had managed to safely be extracted from Tehran. So again, I'm going to assume here, if you will, the absolute success. The more likely scenario, of course, in an alternate timeline that would have turned out that way is there probably might have been, separate from the casualties that actually happened with the debacle at Desert One, the actual thing that called the operation off, there probably would have been casualties in the form of those that were wounded and perhaps killed, and it still may have been deemed a success if it had been overall successful and extracted the hostages. But I'm going to assume sort of the maximum case scenario, at least for the first fork in time that we'll explore here, and that's that there was an absolute success. Everything went as planned. All of the hostages were successfully liberated and returned to the United States, and there was no additional loss of life by American forces that were carrying out the raid and carrying out the rescue attempt. It's key to understand what had been going on in the political background, globally obviously, because of what had happened with the situation with the revolution in Iran and the subsequent taking of the embassy, but also that 1980 was an election year in the United States. And incumbent President Jimmy Carter was facing a challenge not only from a Republican opponent, later in the fall would actually also face a challenge from an independent candidate, John Anderson, who got involved in the election, but was also facing a challenge from inside of his own party for the nomination, that coming from Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy. And so the political backdrop of the situation in Iran is very interesting, and it's relevant to the story because of what actually happens in the what did timeline, the original timeline of history as a result of the failure of Operation Eagle Claw. The U.S. election is contested, and of course the situation that had led up to the election in 1980 is really the result of many things that happened in the 1970s. The 1970s have been a difficult economic decade for the United States, beginning in the early 1970s, with the energy crisis, oil embargoes, and other situations that had caused inflation to become rampant in the United States and creating an economic backdrop that was creating a difficult situation that would have been the case for any incumbent president, but certainly had been inherited by President Carter when he assumed office in the late 1970s. Of course, that's also on the back end of the Watergate scandal and the resignation of President Richard Nixon. So the 1970s was a turbulent time in the United States politics because of political scandal, but also what was going on in the area of the economy. It's also a difficult backdrop globally in terms of foreign policy. While there had been successes during the Carter administration in the area of brokering a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, the famous Camp David Accords, there had also been the situation in the fall of 1979 where the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. And as a result of that, the response by the United States to threaten the boycott of the 1980 Summer Olympic Games, which were scheduled to be held in Moscow. And in fact, there was a boycott by the United States of the 1980 Games and some other Western countries. And so the political backdrop moving into the 1980 election, because of the economy, because of other things that were happening on the global scene, was quite tumultuous. And obviously the economic conditions also being a major factor in the situation leading up to the election itself. So in November of 1979, when the U.S. Embassy in Tehran is seized by student activists and 53 Americans are held hostage, and the beginning of the Iran hostage crisis, this is just another thing that's a backdrop for what is going on as the United States moves into its presidential election cycle in 1980. Initially, following the seizure of the embassy, there was actually a bump in President Carter's approval rating. He actually achieved approval ratings into the 60% range as a result of his calm responses and calm handling of the crisis, something of a rally around the flag phenomena that created a situation where, although his approval ratings prior to that had been lower, a great deal of that as a result of the economic and, again, the other foreign policy situations that I was describing there. As we moved into the early part, the first few months of 1980, there was actually the scenario while he was facing President Carter was facing a challenge from a Democratic opponent for the nomination for his own party, and the Republicans had a spirited contest going on between eventual President Ronald Reagan and George Bush. During the early part, the first few months of 1980, there was a little bit of a surge in support for President Carter because of his rational and cool handling of the situation, as well as the rally around the flag effect. However, that began to turn as the campaign continued, and as it became very clear that there was unlikely to be a negotiated political settlement, a diplomatic settlement to the crisis situation, and it literally became the scenario that each and every night, as the nightly news, particularly the television news, was portrayed itself in the United States, the day count would just increase. In fact, I distinctly remember I was almost teenager at that time. I remember, the phrase was "America held hostage," and it was, day 44, day 45. Eventually, there would be 444 days of the hostage crisis. The modern American news program Nightline, which was very popular in the 1980s and 1990s, actually grew out of a nightly update on television after the evening news that was actually broadcast by the ABC television network. And so to say that there was a spotlight and to say that there was a great deal of attention and focus in the United States on the hostage situation very much is an understatement. The yellow ribbons that were displayed, patriotism, inciting that military action should be taken against Iran. Again, it was a very intense time in American politics. And so this is the background of the stage upon which we find ourselves in April, when after a series of months, the military forces, the special forces in the United States, had come up with and were looking for the approval of a plan to go forward that would actually implement a potential rescue. And that is Operation Eagle Claw. And it was a complex plan. Again, I mentioned I'll include some notes, links in the show notes, so that those who want to get more details about that, but involved operations that included flying into this location that can be known as Desert One for staging area, forces going in by truck, taking and storming the embassy to free the hostages, extracting the hostages through helicopters that would leave from a nearby soccer stadium, returning back to the point where they would be loaded onto planes, fly safely outside the airspace. So it took several months for this operation to be planned and put together, for intelligence to be gathered that enabled the proper planning. And so by the time we reach late March and early April, the decision is being brought to the president as whether or not to proceed with the plan for Eagle Claw. Again, it's now enough time has passed that there was reason to believe there was not going to be a successful diplomatic resolution. And so it had reached the point that President Carter had decided that it was worthy of the risk, and there was considerable risk involved, to carry forward with the proposed rescue plan. So that sets the stage for where we stand now, looking at what would have happened if there had been a successful Operation Eagle Claw. It's important to note that in the real timeline, once the plan had failed, there were a couple of other suggested plans, other thoughts about mounting a rescue attempt, but none of those were able to come to fruition. And so from that point forward, the situation shifted to being almost exclusively a diplomatic resolution of the hostage crisis. And in many ways, while incumbent President Carter did achieve the Democratic nomination, it was in a protracted fight inside of his own party to secure that nomination, with his rival, Senator Ted Kennedy, not withdrawing really from consideration and agreeing or backing him as the nominee until the convention. And a lot of momentum being gained by the Republican opponent once it became clear that Ronald Reagan would be the Republican nominee, talking about not only the situation that existed in the U.S. economy, which of course would have been a backdrop regardless of what was happening with the hostage crisis in Iran and the other factors that were playing into the election, the foreign policy factors, but also being able to focus on the situation where essentially American world pride and world recognition had dropped to the point that students in a foreign land could actually hold members of the United States government's uh, services, in this case those that were in the embassy, hostage and not be held accountable for it. So again, under the scenario where Eagle Claw is successful, it's not hard to imagine at all the wave of patriotism and a feeling of success and vindication that might have happened in the United States that would have been directly attributed to and would have been of benefit to President Carter in his status, both in terms of his job approval rating and just in the eyes of the electorate if Eagle Claw had been successful. The draining effect of having the hostage situation be something that required focus, that was not only away from the campaign, but other capabilities in terms of governing as the incumbent president would have been removed. And one of the things that I would draw as a parallel, for example, in February of that year in 1980, is the famed Miracle on Ice, when the United States hockey team successfully won the gold medal at the 1980 Winter Olympic Games. And the feeling of surging optimism that came as a result of that. In fact, I've seen stories and read stories among political pollsters who talked about one of the reasons that there was a little bit of a surge in the presidential approval rating for Carter in the early part of 1980 was the result initially of him being seen as being a very capable person who was seeking to respond to the hostage crisis, which had emerged in November of 1979, but also was the benefit of that February 1980 event of the victory, the hockey victory at the Olympics, sort of had a carryover effect into the president taking benefit from that. As is often the case in political evaluations, presidential evaluations, I think this is definitely a true thing to say and something that I believe personally. The President of the United States gets too much credit and far too much blame for many things that are actually outside their direct span of control. And in fact, looking at polling data from that time frame, even in the period of April, in polls, national polls, Carter had about a 6 to 7 point lead over Reagan in terms of favorability among the electorate. Now, what was eating into the electorate at that time, of course, was the independent candidate John Anderson, who had come into the race and was certainly seemed to be sapping more support away from Carter than he was perhaps from Reagan, or the support that he was sapping away from Reagan was in the more liberal elements of the Republican Party, with a number of folks being concerned inside of the Republican Party about what they viewed as being the extreme nature of Reagan's conservatism. And of course, 1980 is a realigning election. Don't want to go down that path. That's an entirely different podcast, an entirely different conversation that we could have. But as we find the scene at the time of Eagle Claw in late April and early May, there still is a situation where you can easily imagine that, bolstered by the success of the hostage rescue, bolstered by not having the weighing down effect of the hostage crisis moving forward on the situation in the not just in the election but just in the general governing of the United States and what was going on at that time, a very different outcome. You might have seen certainly another bump or surge in the polling for President Carter. I think there definitely would have been support for him. And I think there are two main things that would have immediately resulted from that. I think it would have put tremendous pressure on the campaign that was being run against him inside of his own party for the nomination. It would have been a lot of pressure placed on Senator Kennedy to withdraw from the race or to not continue in the race and make it a contested race for as long as it was. And under that scenario, you could easily see a situation where it would have then enabled President Carter in his re-election campaign to be more focused towards the general election much earlier, without the issues that beset him for the remainder of that campaign up until the summer, the time of the convention, in terms of just winning and securing the nomination and the support of the major opponent that he had during that campaign. Of course, the other thing that would have also happened from that is that could have assisted just in the overall impression of Carter as an effective leader. And so, aside from more easily capturing his own nomination, his stature inside many of the independents or those who were undecided in the voting status of the United States election that year for the presidency, perhaps would have been more persuaded to give him some slack or to realize that the economic situation was not wholly his, and would have looked perhaps that he would be capable of dealing with the economic situation that had arisen. And certainly he would have been able to focus more time on the economic needs and responding to the economic situation. So I think the most fundamental question going down the fork in time where there's a successful Eagle Claw is the fundamental question of, would that have resulted in the re-election of President Carter in 1980? And while it's impossible to know, and that would have been a difficult proposition because of the other situations that I've described, the situation with Afghanistan, but most importantly, the economy, it is my take that it's much more likely that he would have been reelected. Certainly, it would have changed the dynamics of the general election that fall. He would have been able to point to a success, not only that was a foreign policy success, because it would have been gained under military operation in the case of Eagle Claw, but would have pointed to him as a decisive leader who was willing to take action in defense of American interests, and would have removed some of the ability of Reagan, who was certainly able to take the position of being someone who was stronger in terms of how things should be dealt with on an international stage, particularly with military action or with the willingness to use America's military force when diplomacy was not successful. And so the dynamic of the election, I think, would have changed as a result of not having the hostage situation hanging over the election. It's impossible to know exactly how that would have been because that was the reality again. It's tough to think through because that was such a major factor in the actual election, the way that it played out. But you remove that as something that would have been overshadowing the election, and I think the dynamics of the election would have changed dramatically enough that while you can't say with certainty that President Carter would have been elected, I think it certainly moves it into more being the probability versus just a possibility. And so that changes a lot of things. If you do not have the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, the so-called Reagan Revolution, the subsequent changing over of the United States Congress that swept in behind him and some of the other quote-unquote coattails of that election, you'd have a very different political landscape for the United States moving forward. Under the assumption that most situations when it comes to the economy do tend to work in cycles, then you would have had a scenario between 1980 and 1984 under a Carter administration, perhaps also dealing with a Democratic Congress and not with a Republican Congress, which was the reality in the real timeline following 1980, of the economy recovering and setting up the possibility by the time of 1984 for either Vice President Mondale or another Democratic candidate to actually be in a much better position to succeed an 8-year Carter presidency with economics recovering to the point of there being a surge in the early 1980s, similar to what was actually seen under President Reagan, which, not even getting into the discussion here about whether the tax cuts and other things that were brought by President Reagan caused that to happen or not. Just the nature of the economic cycle more likely resulting in an improvement in the economy such that it would have benefited a 1980 to 1984 second term for President Carter. And then, of course, that changes the dynamics moving forward because now the incumbent in 1984 would be no longer Carter, ending his 8-year requirement or ability to be president, but the incumbent party would have been a Democrat. To me, the similarity that I would draw here is perhaps the situation that would be very similar to 1988 for Republicans, in the sense of at the end of 2 terms for President Reagan, Vice President Bush was able to secure the nomination and secure a victory in the election. I think it's easy to imagine the scenario where either Vice President Mondale would do something similar in 1984 to succeed President Carter for a second term, or even Senator Kennedy, now coming back after withdrawing from the race in 1980, might have set himself up and even perhaps been supported to some degree by Democrats to be the natural next successor, carrying forth and maintaining control of the White House for the Democratic Party. And so, again, while it's not any certain thing that a successful Operation Eagle Claw would have led to the reelection of President Carter, there are certainly scenarios you can point to because of the economy and other factors that I've already mentioned where that would not have happened. I do believe that it's a probability and not just a possibility. And of course, the ripples that flow from that change moving forward do change the landscape of American politics, not only for 4 years, but what happens after that. So it is 1984, Reagan making his second run or second major run. Of course, he had run earlier in 1976, but second major run after being a candidate that came close in 1980? Or would that have also changed the dynamics of the Republican Party and another successor to, again, Reagan was already aging, and in some circles was already considered to be almost too old at that time in 1980 to run for the presidency. Perhaps the failed candidacy of George Bush in 1980 would have resulted in a 1984 Bush candidacy for presidency, where he was not dealing with the same factors that Reagan, and would have been looking to run against what had been 4 more years of Democratic control. So lots of different ways that can play out. We could spend several hours just on the podcast today talking about the political ramifications of a Carter reelection in 1980, but a critical factor in his loss definitely was the fact that the Iranian hostage crisis carried over throughout that entire election. And so if you remove that as a factor, and one of the ways that you would remove it is a successful Operation Eagle Claw, it does have a dramatic impact on the 1980 election, even if it ends up being a successful election for Reagan. The status of the Democratic Party would have at least been stronger, even in defeat, with Carter showing better in the election, certainly than what happened in the real timeline. So that's one of the 2 potential forks from the successful Operation Eagle Claw. One other thing I just want to insert here, because it's also one of those interesting unintended consequences sometimes of changes to historical events, is that the actual failure of Operation Eagle Claw led to the reorganization and rethinking of how a number of things in the United States military should work. That eventually worked out to, by 1986, to actually bills that were passed and that became law in terms of reforming how the military was structured. But even the command of U.S. Special Forces and the organization of U.S. Special Forces changed as a result of the lessons learned during the failure of Operation Eagle Claw. So one of the things that you can also argue that would have been a change or a difference even with the successful Eagle Claw is that there would not have been the need or the desire to look at some of the restructuring that actually did take place in U.S. Special Forces and then ultimately in the United States military. In the various studies and the retrospective looks back on why Eagle Claw failed, there were a number of situations where it was identified that inter-service rivalry and the organization of command structures and the ability to have units that were specially trained for the types of things that were required for a special operation like Eagle Claw really didn't exist. And so the result of the failure, as is often the case in a lot of things in the way that our world works, is often failure leads to greater success in the future because of the things that are learned from the failure. If there's no failure of Operation Eagle Claw, in fact, you might have the effect of a belief that all is fine and good inside of U.S. Special Forces, particularly with the newly formed Delta Force, which has led this operation successfully, and draws upon that, again, not looking to correct the things that went wrong because things didn't go wrong. So under the successful scenario where you have an absolutely successful Operation Eagle Claw, I would argue that one of the other things that would have happened in an alternate timeline is at some point in the future, not sure exactly when this would have been or where this would have been, is you might have a situation where there may have been a more substantial debacle or a more substantial negative thing that would have happened involving U.S. Special Forces because they would not have learned the valuable lessons that were suggested by Eagle Claw and taken corrective action as a result of that. So one of the sort of unintended consequences of a successful Eagle Claw is there's probably an unsuccessful or failed operation later that might have actually been of greater consequence with more loss of life because there would not have been the valuable learnings from the Eagle Claw failures. But also worthy of consideration as another potential fork is not the successful Eagle Claw, but it's a failure of Eagle Claw, but a failure in a very different way. It has been argued by a number of military historians and by writers that in some ways the way that Eagle Claw failed with the aborting of the mission following the issue with the collision at Desert One, the explosion, the loss of 8 servicemen's life, that was actually a merciful way for the mission to come to an end. There are a number of military historians and again other writers who have explored the situation suggesting that that enabled, and for good reason, the mission to be aborted and only resulted in that being the nature of the failure. And while humiliating and while disappointing to have the failure that way, a scenario under which what had actually happened is that during the complicated plan and the process, that there had been a larger loss of American life, either the hostages, some of the hostages, or some of the military personnel that were involved in the rescue, perhaps a firefight that would have resulted in the loss of American military life and no successful rescue of the hostages, or any number of things that could have happened or could have failed along the way in terms of the complexity of the plan, where there would have been failure, but failure in the sense that hostages were lost or additional U.S. forces were lost, would have been far worse than what actually happened at Desert One. And so, under that scenario, looking at the other fork, other than the successful fork, is what would have been the results of an even more, I'll just say, notable or abysmal failure of the planned rescue attempt. If Eagle Claw had failed, but failed in a more notable fashion. And I think it's easy to imagine, while all of the success that I mentioned in the earlier fork that would have been attributed to President Carter, and the benefit that would have happened in terms of the potential change in the outcome to the election, is that very much the opposite effect would have taken place with a more substantial failure for Eagle Claw. It was already a blow. In fact, after that, you will begin to see the decline in his presidential approval ratings, and you will see the dynamics of the election change. But under a scenario where there would have been a more robust failure, it's easy to see that he would have been blamed. Now, not previously been blamed for not successfully taking action. Now he would have been blamed for taking risks that should not have been assumed, for exposing the United States to risks that should not have happened. And under one scenario, potentially because of that, let's say that there had been an engagement between U.S. military forces and Iranian military forces as a result of the situation, the attempted rescue attempt, that there might have been a situation where there might have been an escalated conflict in Iran, where it might have become necessary either out of pride or to rectify the situation for the United States to send additional forces. It could have resulted in the capture and holding now not only of the civilians that were inside the embassy, the 53 hostages, but now the capture of U.S. military personnel. A number of different ways you could have imagined that a failure actually inside of Tehran during the primary operation could have led to a situation that would have been worse than what existed before the rescue attempt had actually taken place. And that set of tensions that could have arisen between the United States and Iran, again, escalation perhaps to something on a military level, could have not just been contained solely to the United States and Iran. It's remembering that the situation that existed in the Middle East, the tensions that existed among a number of different factions and forces there in the United States, could have caused an escalation to something that would have been larger than just a conflict with Iran. It's easy to forget that one of the simultaneous events that's actually going on in history at this particular time is sometimes referred to as the Siege of Mecca, where there had been a situation where there was the holding of hostages at the holiest shrine for Islam in Mecca. That's going on simultaneously. In fact, that ultimately leads to some of the rise of Al-Qaeda and other situations that continued to move forward in Middle Eastern politics and the religious politics of the Middle East for the next couple of decades. And so while the escalation of tensions between the United States and Iran as a result of U.S. military action taking place on Iranian soil in an effort to rescue the hostages could have escalated tensions and ultimately escalated the conflict between the United States and Iran, it's also easy to imagine that conflict might have grown to be outside of just the area of the United States and Iran, might have erupted into a much larger regional conflict involving a number of different powers and those that were loyal to the United States. It's certainly possible to imagine that a retaliatory situation back against the nation of Israel could have happened as a result of the U.S. action, thus causing the United States to feel the need to escalate its involvement. And so it's been argued again by a number of historians that one of the mercies of the disaster at Desert One, the staging area, was that it averted the potential if a larger failing had happened with Eagle Claw that would have been much more substantial and led to something much more disastrous in terms of the way that it would have rippled through history. And so my take on the impact of a different outcome for Eagle Claw really takes two, I think, widely divergent streams. A successful Operation Eagle Claw, the first fork that I described here, particularly the one that is an absolute complete success, would have had a tremendous effect in moving history in one direction, again, towards, I think, the likely reelection of President Carter and the impact that that would have had moving forward on the political timeline, not only in the United States, but globally, particularly as how things might have dealt with the situation of what was still the Cold War at that time between the United States and the Soviet Union, how that would have been different under a Carter presidency and then perhaps a subsequent Democratic successor than it was under the Reagan-Bush scenario. You can argue either side of that equation. You might want to consider one of our former episodes where we looked at the possibility if Reagan had not survived the assassination attempt on his life in 1981. But then the other extreme is also, I think, just as wide in another direction, where the situation could have erupted into another conflict, pulling the United States deeper into conflict in the Middle East, not just in Iran, but in other parts of the Middle East because of what could have flowed from those events. Someone described what could have happened there in terms of Operation Eagle Claw as being very much like a Bay of Pigs type of scenario for the United States, only happening in a different theater of the world. And so I think Eagle Claw, those events in April of 1980, actually proved very important because what actually did happen created sort of a middle ground for the timeline that we know. But either success or a different form of failure, I think, would have produced a very different outcome in the near-term situation in the early 1980s, and certainly the way that that would have rippled out as we move down to our present timeline would have been very different. And so I guess it's interesting to say that a sandstorm in the Iranian desert in April of 1980 had much more of an impact on world events than might well be imagined, and that the collision of two aircraft, because of the way that the refueling operation had to take place during that rescue attempt, and that explosion was a small explosion that avoided bigger explosions that could have come throughout history. So it's just something to think about, and realizing that the what-ifs can sometimes have multiple possibilities. When we talk about the fork in time, the fork is not always just a simple left or right in the road. Forks have multiple prongs. And many of the events in history that we look at here on A Fork in Time have multiple possible outcomes based upon a change to the events that are there. So once again, we thank you for joining us today on A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Hope you've enjoyed this exploration and that it's caused you to think about a different scenario relative to what would have happened if Eagle Claw had succeeded or failed in a different way. And again, that's what we do here on the podcast. If you're new to the podcast, let you know this is sort of what we do in every episode. It's looking at alternative history, and so we'd invite you to go back and listen to our back catalog, get more familiar with the podcast, and maybe move forward with us. If you're a long-term listener, again, as we always like to say, thank you for being part of the podcast as we've been growing it here over its first year of existence. And we would encourage whether you're a long-time listener or a first-time finder of the podcast to visit our website at www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. You can find our back catalog there, learn more about the podcast, provide feedback, all the things that we remind you every week that you can do in every episode. If you'd like to support the podcast and you're able to do so financially, you can do that through our Patreon page. You can find the link to that on our page at www.aforkandtimepodcast.com or go directly to patreon.com/aforkandtime. Just your small contribution there each month helps to fund and defray the cost of the podcast and enables us to continue to grow it moving forward. So if you can or are willing to, we would just ask you to consider that as part of our support. Certainly another thing that you can do is leave us ratings and reviews, particularly at Apple Podcasts. Being able to be found is one of the more difficult things in the podcast universe. There's so many out there today. And so being well recognized inside of the search engines at Apple Podcasts and the other podcatchers, the other places that people get their podcasts, can be very important. And ratings and positive reviews can be a big part of that, making us more visible in the search engines. But also, once people find us, when they see positive reviews, they're more likely to give us a chance to give us a listen. And so if you have a few moments to do that, we would just encourage you to do so. It can be as simple as just giving a starred review or maybe even leaving a few comments there. And of course, we do welcome your comments and your feedback via our webpage and taking those into account. We've continued to try to morph and evolve what the podcast is, and we'll continue to do so. In fact, in some coming episodes, here in the next few episodes, we'll actually give some insights into some of the feedback that we've received and some of the things that we're looking at doing and changing as we move the podcast forward as a result of that feedback. So if you haven't given us that feedback, either informally on the website or by taking our listener survey, you'll find the link inside of the show notes here to do either of those things. We would encourage you to do so. Most importantly, again, we thank you for your time. We know that the time is one of the most generous gifts that anyone has to give, and we thank you that you've given us some of yours. And so signing off, wishing you a good day, and hoping you join us next time. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.